Well, I have to admit that I really didn't trust Henry when I first met him. For one thing, within 5 minutes of sitting down, he was telling me he'd been incarcerated, he'd been a drug dealer, he'd been an addict, he'd been a thief, he'd been a robber. And while I thought it was very nice that he was being honest, I kept wondering, isn't there some point that you get disqualified from the pulpits? Is there not a minimum test score that you have to achieve to get up here? Can anybody stand up there? And I would have probably distrusted him and continued on because, let's face it, we don't trust different. And especially when it comes to faith, we do not trust different. It's always, this is mine, that's theirs, good, bad. And I might have been the same way, except that I was spending that time with the Reb, seeing what a man of faith could be like behind the robes. And so I decided to try the same thing with Henry. And so instead of just going to see him during business, I went and saw his services. Now, that wasn't always so easy. Here I was, a kid used to a synagogue, the Reb up here talking about the Old Testament, squash, wood, hammer, funny things, and suddenly I'm inside a plastic tent hearing a pastor talk about drug addiction and spousal abuse and crack pipes. Here I was, this white suburban kid from a Jewish synagogue, suddenly making the first visit to the black church. And if those of you who have never crossed that bridge for the first time know, it can be a little unusual because we're pretty much used to people up here talk, people down there listen. That ain't the way it works in Henry's church. Pretty much everybody has a say pretty much all the time. So at any point, someone may just jump up and scream, hallelujah. Someone may say, praise Jesus. Someone may say, preach it, preach it. Or in the case of this guy named Virgil, he just likes to stand up every now and then and go, well. No apparent reason or timing with the service. Just Henry will say, let's turn to page 113. Well, okay, it was different. And we don't trust different. But I gave it a shot. And I found out a lot of things about this man behind the robe and behind the pulpit. For example, when he first arrived in Detroit, Henry drove around the neighborhood in an old car with food on the trunk and the hood of his car. 1 to 2 miles an hour so it wouldn't fall off. Turkeys and hams and bottles of juice. And the homeless people in the area who were squatting in apartments would come running out because he had food. And he fed them. Literally fed them. Just fed the hungry. What could be more Christian than that? Nothing in return. Didn't have to join the church. Just fed the hungry. And along the way, he met a man named Cass. He was a crack addict who was squatting in an apartment. He was missing a leg. And Henry felt sorry for him. And he said, do you need some work? I can give you a couple bucks unloading the food. Yeah, Cass said, I'll take that. Unfortunately, Cass had a very unique distribution system. 1 for the church, 2 for him. He would throw the food over into the bushes and then sell it later for drugs. Henry knew what he was doing, but he didn't say anything. He waited. He waited and watched. And one night, Cass, in the apartment where he was squatting, fell asleep and someone broke in and stole the pipes for copper and burst the water main, and he floated, literally floated out of the apartment because it was totally flooded. And he came to the pastor the next day soaking wet, and he said, Pastor, I can't work for you today. These are the only clothes I got, and they're all soaked out. And Henry looked at him and said, go into the church, and on the 2nd floor, there's racks of clothes. Take whatever you need. It was the first time in 3 years that Cass had clean underwear. He came back, and Henry said to him, now, where will you live, Cass? Cass said, I don't know. I ain't got no place. And Henry thought for a moment, and he said, why don't you live with me? And he moved him into his home that night and let him sleep in the one spare room that they had in this tiny house while Henry and his 3 children and his wife lived upstairs. A virtual stranger sleeping on their ground floor. Not for a night, not for a week, for a year. A year. Well, do you know that today, Cass is not only clean and sober and has been for years, but he's also an elder of the church, and he married a woman from the church, and they have a beautiful little girl whose name is Miracle and who runs around the place as if she owns it. All because of the kindness one man showed to another behind the robes. And Cass will be the first to tell you he is alive today only because of that kindness.